Agriculture in business. It's a very, very important part of the Bainbridge Graduate Institute, a business school that talks an awful lot about sustainability. In fact, that's the reason why it exists. And we're talking with the academic dean, John Gardner. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Do I refer to you as Dean Gardner or Professor?
John.
John, okay. Let's talk about agriculture in business because that's kind of your background, isn't it? Tell us a little bit more about where you've been, and you were talking about all the different land-grant universities.
Well, I'm a native, I'm a sixth generation Missourian, long-time Missourian, both sides of my family. Went to Kansas State, University of Nebraska, North Dakota State, was on the faculty, was a vice president at University of Missouri, and most recently vice president at Washington State. So I've been at 5 land-grant universities. I'm an agronomist by background and training. And my thing was in the Great Plains crop production, particularly the development of new crops. And so it led to a formation of a business in the 90s called Agro Oils in North Dakota, where it was actually a grower-owned business owned by 540 farmers who were the members, who were the producers, and so we had an integrated system of kind of designer production, processing, and marketing of the seeds. We owned the entire supply chain.
Wow.
And it was very much in vogue in North Dakota and has been for actually decades. North Dakota has a very interesting agricultural history, a very interesting agricultural business history. So a lot of my, the business, I'm an agronomist and kind of a dirt farmer by background and training, but the business part of it is something we really lived and my family lived in the 20 years we spent in North Dakota.
Well, so let's talk about the business of agriculture because it seems that around the world today, there may not be a more important time for the business of agriculture, especially as developing economies truly do start to develop and grow their own, essentially. Are there similarities in the developing countries from an agriculture in business standpoint and what the United States did as it grew up?
Drastically differently. In a way, if you think of think of the developing world now that maybe leapfrog past copper wire and landline phones as we know it, and have a cell phone today, standing in an otherwise very undeveloped surroundings. So too it is with agriculture and food systems. The technology that we can package in variety selection, in crop selection, in animal selection can be delivered anywhere in leapfrog. And that's one thing that's really changed the world right now in terms of food and agriculture are those technologies, the distribution of those technologies, who owns those technologies and how they're used. And so it's a vastly different story. It's very dynamic times for food and agriculture.
Something really interesting is that wherever you go, they're talking about, well, the planet is holding 8 billion, the planet is going to hold 9, maybe we can even hold as many as 10 billion. But then the next thing, the question is how are we going to feed all those people?
Yeah. It's a question that's been asked for at least several centuries, and will probably be continued to ask for several centuries. And food is it's fundamentally how we interact with nature. It's fundamentally how we interact with biology. Physics, chemistry. It's fundamentally how we interact with the environment. It's fundamentally how we feed ourselves. And that's why it's so, I think, such a cornerstone industry to any civilized society and its growth. And that's why people will ultimately put more resources into it to ensure that food is taken care of first. And that's why I think, anyway, why for centuries we've talked about how are we going to continue to feed, and then we did find out a way to put more resources into it. Intellectual resources and sometimes other kinds of resources as well into agriculture.
All right, so from an educational standpoint, if I don't want to be a farmer, why should I learn anything about the business of agriculture?
Well, it turns out, and coming to BGI, after being at 5 land-grant universities, a relative newcomer to the Northwest, only been here almost 5 years, coming to BGI, I was shocked by the interest in food and agriculture in these students, many of which I would consider had really no background in agriculture. But when I get to learn and talk to them more deeply, they all have a background in food. They all have a background in the supply chain and a notion of the supply chain of agriculture. and the impact it has on the land, the environmental systems that are around us, the impact on our urban environment as well. And I've actually grown in a fond appreciation of that experience. I think the Pacific Northwest, the West Coast, is probably leads maybe this country in that notion of that tight connection. But we have a lot of people vitally interested in food and agriculture. And you don't have to be raising crops or be in the field or feeding hogs to be involved in agriculture. Everybody's involved in agriculture if they eat.
All right, but do I know how to grow corn to be able to sell it?
You don't necessarily have to, and of course that's the specialization of society. And it was agriculture's professionalism actually that led to civil society, at least in my view, allowed people to specialize, and that's still the case. But today, the food and agricultural system that we created. And the goods and the bad things about our food chain, our supply chain for agriculture. We're created by policy, we're created by technologies, we're created by our own advent, and it can be redesigned by our own advent. And in fact, that's the one thing at BGI I'm particularly interested in. Our class is going to, our course, our certificate is going to focus on the design of new supply chains for food.
Now, are these supply chains here in the United States, or are they global in nature?
We're going to look at supply chains from the hyper-local to the global. Because in agriculture, whether you may not experience it every day or not, they're all quite vitally connected. For example, the global agricultural system dictates the price of most of our inputs, most of our seeds, most of our fertilizers, the land, and everything else. It really dictates that price. And so even if you're a hyper-local permaculturist in the Pacific Northwest, you're living in an environment, you're living in a bubble, and you're living in a global food bubble that is dictating a lot of the trade all around you. And so you're vitally involved.
It's a movement, and there may be two movements going on at the same time, where genetically engineered seeds are not replicable. But at the same point in time, they may grow more. They grow more crops. Then there are organic seeds, which, once the farmer has them, then the farmer gets to keep them, and then grows and grows and grows again. Which is better? I don't think that's the right question, if I say. Okay.
And the reason I say that is, as we've learned about biology, as we've learned about how animals grow and plants grow and humans grow, for that matter, as we learn how the environment works, the passing of genetics, the passing of genes, the relationship of us to our forebears, the relationship between us and every other living being is actually highly correlated. Our genes are highly shared among us. What we have learned to do is breed plants and breed animals and put together production systems that speed up that natural system. We have learned to do that, and these have been some powerful tools. The most powerful tool, as you mentioned, like genetic engineering, so to speak. And to most people, that means taking a gene from one species and putting it in another. That happens naturally, actually, over time. That's why we share probably a high proportion of the genes with a housefly. But it doesn't happen at the speed in which we can do it now with modern molecular biology. That is the question, and how best to use that tool. Is that tool ill-spent for naught, or is it reserved for good? And that really is the question. In global food terms right now, unfortunately, we have a very polar discussion going on of whether,
particularly in India.
Yeah, whether this particular tool is going to be used or not used. Well, if you go back in agricultural history, we were arguing over other tools 100 years ago and 200 years ago. It's the tool of the day. But the implications and the principles of that restraint and knowing how to fit it into the whole ecosystem is the key. And that is what really we need to have the wisdom of approaching in today's food systems globally. Like we never have before, because like I said, we have the tools and the distribution of those tools like we've never had before. And now I would hope that, and you see this happening around the globe, a real convergence on food and agricultural systems that are regionally appropriate, regionally sound for both the people and their economy and the environment, but they also make global sense because stitched together around the globe, they'll form a system that's really resilient, really durable, really resistant to any one thing taking it out.
Is that happening today? Who's responsible for nutrition, for example?
Well, nutrition, nutrition is public policy, frankly, right now, like it or not. How much corn we eat, how much soy we eat, what's in our meat, what's not in our meat, really is public policy. It's set by food policy in this country. It's set by other countries, and of course they talk to have a similar food policy. But I would say the globalization of food policy is happening right now, as well as this globalization of technologies, which gives me some hope that people are going to be at the table.
Well, here's why I asked that question. We know here in the United States and all around the world, if we take in too much sugar in our diet, that it's bad for us. And yet at the same point in time, sugar is still a very, very popular agricultural product here in the United States. It would seem that since we have an obesity epidemic, that policy should dictate, sugar is going to be real expensive.
Yeah.
But we won't go there.
No, and there's many vested interests. There is no political. I grew up. I cut my teeth on the political economy of agriculture in the Midwest, and it's powerful, and it's powerful for a reason. It's powerful for a reason because of the trade and the implications it has globally. But in terms of how it affects us nutrition-wise, how it affects us industrially, those are critical questions we constantly have to keep up with. It's a bit of a sad notion that never before in history of this planet has, as it is in this country right now, poverty be linked to obesity. Poverty be linked to diseases and chronic diseases that are related to obesity and malnutrition, not from undernutrition, from imbalanced nutrition. And that's poor public policy that we've allowed that to happen. But I stand with agricultural policy as a whole to, again, put everyone at the table to help resolve this. And I think you're starting to see those kinds of changes at USDA, certainly in this country. And I think you're seeing it in like I said, the global community, in the Food and Ag Organization in Rome, and in other bodies globally that are looking at this, including the United Nations.
We're going to take a very short break. We're talking with John Gardner, who is the Academic Dean at the Bainbridge Graduate Institute. We're talking about the business of agriculture and how the BGI itself approaches the business of agriculture and other things at BGI. So strongly encourage you to go to the website. It's up on the screen. Let's continue on then with the business of agriculture. And let's say that you were in the fast food business. That's agricultural too, isn't it? From BGI standpoint, how do you teach them sustainability if you're going to be in the fast food business?
Yeah. Well, the fast food business really is a byproduct of a lot of our food policy in terms of the commodity and commodity supports. Otherwise, the fast food system as we have it now would not have evolved. And so the way we would go about it, and the way we're going to go about it in this certificate that starts in the fall, is to ask the questions of the outcomes that we want. From a nutrition perspective, a social perspective, the environmental perspective, certainly the perspective of profit and profitability. But what we're going to go about doing is compare, let's say, the fast food system that goes from commodity agriculture into those products at a subsidized public policy cheap price, and look at the vulnerabilities of that particular design of that supply chain, and then on a fresh board, redesign a supply chain that might work and have better outcomes at the same kind of profitability. And I'm convinced that those are out there. Unfortunately, I think in agriculture in this country, we've looked at far too few models of how to take the seed to the plate, or how to take take the livestock products or any of the other products that we have in agriculture to the plate. We've looked at far too business models, few business models. And so that's what I said. Our certificate is a bit of a pilot, a bit of an experiment, where we're not going to study organic farming or how to raise grass-fed beef particularly. What we are going to do is try how to design a business and someone who's willing to take that supply chain and reconnect some dots, such that it provides a foods and nutritious foods and at a profit and in protection of the environment and for people availability and accessibility locally that can't be had through the current business models. Far too few. We think that there's been far too little creativity put in terms of design of food businesses. And agriculture is just, agriculture is waiting for this. Agriculture is waiting for this, and what's going to have to follow is public policy to help allow these business designs to actually flourish.
So is the business of agriculture model in the United States broken?
It depends on what measures you want. If you want cheap food, if you would look at the most recent data, there is nothing in the American consumer's market basket of goods that has fallen in the value and the proportion of income that's spent by Americans than food. I'm talking energy, transportation, housing, clothing, any of other consumer product. There is nothing that's fallen like food from a proportion of our total income. Now that didn't happen by happenstance. That happened because we put a policy in place. We believed that that was politically necessary to have a cheap food policy. But again, I would say if we design that, we can design other things. We can design improvements with better nutritional outcomes, better environmental outcomes, and retain profitability for rural America. Because rural America is the other thing that's critical here. Most of what has happened in post-World War II, certainly economy in this country, has certainly been to the benefit of suburban America and urban America in terms of concentration. 85% of our country now lives in a metro area, but it's that 15% of the rest of the country, which is rural America, which is also closely tied to the political economy of agriculture and food systems. And I would suggest that those people are just as progressive about wanting modification and being progressive and good nutritional outcomes and good environmental outcomes as is urban America. But they're standing at the different end of the supply chain to do so. And thus this notion of redrawing really business designs, we think, for food and ag systems.
At the beginning of the show, we talked about how the different land-grant universities that you were at, big universities, big state schools. Now you're at a small private school in Western Washington State. Why'd you go there?
People have asked me that a lot, and it's really two reasons, personal and professional. Personally, I had to take in this period of my life, being in a sandwich generation, I needed it. My family needed me actually to be closer to home and to spend more time, and I wanted to honor that. Professionally, and I think your question is really about the professional. Professionally, I am convinced that education in this country, if not the world, but particularly in the U.S., is going to be radically disrupted. Certainly within the next decade, certainly within the next 15 years, it's going to be radically disrupted. And I mean that from a technology perspective, how we teach, what we teach, where we teach is going to have to radically change because we cannot afford the educational system that we have built. So I've stood at 5 universities. I've been a vice president at 2. I've looked at those. I love those universities. I love the notion of the land-grant university. I'm still a faculty member at Washington State University. But I'm convinced during this radical time of change, if I was going to take the limited portion of my time, where was I going to spend it? Was I going to spend it in the center of this table that is really insulated by being a public institution and therefore having to, frankly, not move at a public institution pace? Or was I instead going to be at the edge? of the people that were going to be with the brush cutters and creating the educational systems for tomorrow. And failing sometimes, absolutely. But being the ones that are creating the pathways for the large public institutions, I want to dedicate some time, and I'd rather be on the edge. And if you meet Gifford Pinchot, if you meet Jill Bamberg, if you meet the faculty at BGI, if you meet the students at BGI, these are people willing to be at the edge. It seems like a fun place to be in a disruptive environment. And I think we're about to enter a very disruptive environment in education.
Sometimes they call that the bleeding edge.
We like to be state-of-the-art and just off the bleeding edge. But let me tell you, I think we've been at the bleeding edge a time or two. I've been at BGI 10 months. I think I've been at the bleeding edge a time or two.
If a student comes to BGI and includes the business of agriculture in their education, what are they going to learn?
I think the main thing they're going to learn is a connection from many of the other alternative agricultural systems out there. I would hope they would have an appreciation for how conventional agriculture and big agriculture works, how global agriculture works, not be dismissive of it, not suggest it is a villainous evil that's off in the corner somewhere. I would hope they have an appreciation and understand that, and then yet have the courage to design new kinds of systems that are going to be the future. Those are the kind of students that we're looking for. We're partnering with the land-grant universities in this certificate. We're bringing in the experts from WSU and UC Davis and Oregon State and Iowa State and Cornell and Purdue. They're helping us with this curriculum, and they're going to be part of it. But again, we can afford to be at the edge of the table in this regard. And we're going to try to make our curriculum as well into an enhanced textbook. We're going to try to put our curriculum into an electronic mode that can be easily shared at those other land grants after we cut some brush down. And so that's what we're looking for, is courageous students here at First to seek some fresh ground.
You wrote an article, it's been a few years ago now, and the title of it was, in part, the title was What is Sustainable Agriculture? Would you answer it the same way today?
I was in the very beginning of the sustainable agriculture movement with Wes Jackson at the Land Institute, Fred Kirschman in North Dakota, who's a friend, a dear friend, and a real leader in the sustainable agriculture movement. I was on the first committee for LISA, Low Input Sustainable Agriculture for the United States Department of Agriculture. And so I was at that, all at the forefront. And then went into business and kind of walked away from it. And then I was a university administrator. And now, interestingly, I'm back at BGI in this full circle. I would answer it much the same way. I looked at it from a rural perspective, that being environmental integrity and social justice for rural America and profitability. In other words, that rural people didn't deserve to be serfs for this country in order to prop up the rest of society. I look at it from a totally different perspective now with the help of BGI, with the help of a city like Seattle, with a state like Washington. I look at it from a totally different perspective, but I'd have to say fundamentally it's the same issues. Some of them have been solved and new ones have arisen.
Does a student get a global viewpoint at BGI?
We're really working on that. We have just initiated our first study abroads. The students went to Cuba last summer.
Wow.
They're going to China this summer. We had our first exchange student from India who came from the School of Inspired Leadership near Delhi, India. Some of our faculty are teaching at that school in India. So we, in my view, and it's, I think, been in the long-term plans of Gifford and Jill, but we're finally to the point where we can institute BGI as a real global entity. And it's because, just as we've been talking in food and agriculture, it's true in all of business. These are global issues. They have to be resolved locally, but they have to fit in, and you have to know the global scope in which to be successful. And so we are attempting to globalize both our curriculum, our student body, and I think the whole institution as quickly as we can.
So many things that we've talked about is the huge, massive changes that the world is undergoing right now. It doesn't matter what the cause of it is, it matters that it is happening. Before the show, we were talking about the changes in teaching as well, and that actually the students learn from each other as much as they learn from a professor.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you how that makes you feel, but the question is how do you deal with that, and is that part of your curriculum, teacher or students teaching students?
Absolutely. We consider BGI a learning community, meaning that, and if you go there and just experience and get a tiniest taste of BGI, you'll see that. In other words, the students are assertive, constructively assertive with each other. And they learn in teams, and they learn from each other. But it really, once I've experienced it, it's not like any educational experience I've had at the large institutions, very traditional institutions. But when I harken back to agriculture in my work in rural North Dakota for 20 years of my life, hey, who did I learn from? As a researcher, I learned from farmers, and farmers learn from each other. It's the practitioner and the academic, if they both have that willingness to come together, that can really make magic happen.
Mm-hmm. Was that when you were in that biofuels business?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's the same is true at BGI. The students are practitioners. We bring faculty in as practitioners, and we bring faculty in as academics. And I am convinced that when a student teaches or learns for a teacher, they quickly assess where the bar is, because you have one person setting the bar, and they'll learn to jump over that bar. But if the students are learning for everyone, and they're challenged by everyone, they set the bar much higher. And there's actually been research that has suggested this, is that when students learn from each other, there'll be even greater outcomes. And because their willingness and their motivation to learn is set at a much higher bar for peers than it would be for instructors.
Well, this doesn't sound like you've got a textbook and then there's a PowerPoint that the publisher provides for you to be able to teach the students. This sounds like something completely different. How do you integrate this as part of your curriculum, I guess?
Well, what we're trying to do is something, part of this revolution in education called Flipping the Classroom, Sal Khan and the Khan Academy. In other words, you learn the lectures, you cover the material when you're at home and asynchronously online. And if you have to watch a video once, great. If you have to watch it 100 times, great. You've learned the material. But when you come together, what you do is don't sit passively in the classroom and listen to the instructor. Instead, what you do is practice what you learn, demonstrate what you've learned. And that can be through exercises, it can be through gaming, it can be through dialogue, debate, it can be through presentations. In other words, it's the exchange and the practice with both the teacher and your fellow students when you're together that is the magic that leads to the mastery. It's not sitting passively in the classroom covering the material. That is an education of yesterday. And at BGI, we've been trying to usher in, quote unquote, flipping the classroom as quickly as we can. And I think what you're seeing across the country in the best institutions in the land is the same darn thing. They're all recognizing how rapidly they must make that switch.
So getting back then to the business of agriculture, which is what we started with, and what, unfortunately, we only have a minute left, what we have to end with. I'm a student from Ghana, or I'm a student from Germany, or I'm a student from Germantown, Tennessee, and I'm looking at BGI, particularly with regard to the business of agriculture. Are my opportunities equally as strong?
We would hope so, because again, we're going to try to put our prototypes into kind of a, as they're calling them today, enhanced textbooks. Distance education is probably a term that does it disservice, because it's a living document, this design of new food and agri systems. And it's as relevant in Ghana as it would be in Georgetown, as in South Seattle. It's just as relevant. And so what we're hoping to build, with the students' help, after a few iterations, is a vital textbook we could have online for students to actually participate globally in the food and ag system. And we're trying to do that in our other parts of the curriculum as well.
Well, John, thank you for being with us. That was John Gardner, who is the academic dean at the Bainbridge Graduate Institute. Be sure to go to the website and also check out the Business of Agriculture Certificate Program there at BGI. We'll see you right here next time on Rainmakers TV. Take care.